was like being in a coma for 5 years, being away from the UK on a big hitchhiking adventure. Coming back was like waking up from that coma. Things had moved on, technology had moved on, definitely. People had moved on with their lives. It was as if I had been completely absent for 5 years. So I'll talk about that shortly, but this week is the first episode I've pre-recorded because, well, if you're hearing this, then the baby's here, and I'm either having, well, I'm probably having the best time and the worst time at the same time with this little baby and Emma. So more on that when I come back. But I'll just do a little overview of the big hitchhiking trip before I go into what it was like coming back from it. So I started off in 2017 from Falmouth in Cornwall and made it across to the end of the UK. There was a whole episode I did about the very first day, which was, at the time, it was the hardest day of my life. It probably still is the hardest day of my life, thinking about that, because I knew what was ahead of me, and I knew that what was ahead of me was mostly unpredictable, but I'd heard previously other people talking about what it was like in those countries, what it was like to travel across Russia, to travel across Kazakhstan, China, things like that. And I know I had to hitchhike in it. I wasn't cycling, I wasn't able to just keep my head down and get through, or I wasn't walking, I couldn't just be self-sufficient. I had to rely on other people to get me through these places. And so that was extremely worrying and paralysing. I actually couldn't put my arm up to hitchhike. So I managed to talk myself into it. Have a look at that. I think it's episode 4, I think. It's around there anyway, if you want to hear about that. And after that, it was into France and made it all across France and into Germany, and for some reason went up into Denmark and back out again. It was just someone was going there, and I thought, why not see a new country? And then came across, went back into Europe, into Poland, all the way through, into these countries that are now going to sound made up, but I went into Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, lovely, lovely places, and then into Russia. And Russia was not what I expected at all. It was incredibly beautiful, and the people were absolutely lovely. Very cold, very reserved, but once you got talking to them, they were really, really nice, really friendly, really genuine. So I saw a lot of myself in them because I look very cold. I've got something called resting bitch face, I think it is. And I look really annoyed, really distant when you haven't spoken to me before. But then when you do, I'm like this. I'm very friendly, very genuine, very nice. Most of the time anyway. Anyway, made it across Russia after being followed by the FSB. They thought I was a British spy, which was fun. And after that into Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan was mostly empty space, but the parts that were occupied were just even more friendly and genuine. It was interesting, the further away from the UK I was getting, the nicer people were becoming. They started letting me into their homes. I'd be walking along in the evening as the sun was going down, and they wouldn't hear of it. They wouldn't hear of me not coming into their house and feasting with their family on all this food that they made. So they were absolutely lovely. There were a lot of tears at how nice they were. I was just constantly I just couldn't believe it. So after that, went into Uzbekistan, and it was much the same sort of thing. Just really, really friendly, really nice to the traveller, really. Tajikistan, mostly mountains, but again the same, very nice, very friendly. And then at that point, I had no visa to get into China, and they wouldn't give it to me. They said to me, you have to go back home and have the interview, but I couldn't leave that. I couldn't leave the little bubble I was in of this adventure. I felt like I was becoming a new person. I was growing. I was seeing the world, and the world back home had changed already, and I didn't want to go back and get updated and then come out and leave this adventure. And it had to be one trip. It just had to be. I still haven't found a very good way of explaining why, but if you've been on a big adventure yourself and you've had to come home, or you've risked coming home halfway, you may know what it's like. but it's really hard to explain. It was something like if you've had a baby as well, you're in this bubble when the baby's here and you don't want to go back to work, not because you hate your job, but because you're in this new world, and if you leave it, it's a bit like waking up from a dream, I suppose. You can't really go back to it. That's a good way of explaining it, actually. So yeah, I couldn't leave the trip. I had to get it done there and then, and I knew I could. There was always a way if you just keep at it. If you just keep at something, there's a way to get it done. It might not be obvious now how that is. It might not be immediately clear how you can get it done, but if you just keep going, the information changes itself in front of you. It's always the information is the same, but how you're seeing it is different, and your perspective will change. You'll see different meanings in the words that you're reading. So, and that's exactly what happened. I realised that I was assuming that I had to go back to my country of citizenship to get the interview, but I could, according to the Chinese embassy, go to my country of residency. And I could get a new country of residency. I could make one. I could go and live somewhere for 6 months and gain residency. Nearest place on the route was Georgia, which, if you've ever seen the route map, I'll put it up now. I went all the way back to Georgia, but that was the nearest thing. That was the best I could do. So I lived there for 6 months, gained residency, found work as a journalist, and a tour guide as another job, and saw all these. It was really, really nice to live somewhere again. It was nice to feel a little bit settled, to start having a group of friends and colleagues, and to know the map of the area quite well, and the best places for this kind of food. And I'd got a girlfriend as well, and that was really nice. Made a group of friends, work colleagues, that kind of thing. So it's amazing how quickly and easily you can actually make a new life for yourself. And I've done it many times. It's got to be close to 100 times that I've gone somewhere new and established a new identity with new people, new friends, and it's very easy to do that. But there's nothing like living where you grew up, because where I live now is where I grew up for the longest time. And the woman I've married, Emma, we went to school together, and one of my best friends went to school as well with us. And it's different because they're that embedded in your past, that there's this connection you have with them, that it's more than you can have with someone you've just met, even if they're the most like you, the most best friend ever. Like, it's not, they weren't with you in the beginning. There's something about that there's just, I think this is why I've returned to Gloucester, because it's the place I'm most rooted, I suppose, and it's one of the furthest places back in my past, I think. So that's why I've come back here. But you can, if you're unhappy, you can start again anytime. It's very easy to do. It's very frightening to do that. It's very frightening to leave. It's very unnerving, very unsettling, and it will be really, really hard if you do, because you'll be starting again. You won't have any friends, you won't have a job, you won't have all this stuff that you take for granted, but you'll be free to make it better again. So there was a whole episode about that again. I think that was episode 5, I'm not sure. But anyway, I had to leave Georgia eventually, unfortunately. I had the visa in my hand, which I couldn't quite believe. And that was it. I'd set off again, made it through China. China was nothing to recommend. It was probably the worst country I've been to. Of all the countries on this trip, China's the only one I wouldn't say catch a plane and go to. Definitely don't go there. It's extremely Orwellian, and I know that people use that word quite freely these days, and it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it was an authoritarian nightmare. Really, it was like being inside 1984. Every street corner, there were people watching you, sometimes checking your bags. There were either cameras everywhere, and by everywhere I mean about once every 100 meters. there was no part of the city, Kashgar, the first one I went to, there was no part of that city that wasn't visible by camera. And if there weren't cameras, there were false cameras that made you think you were being watched. And on the roads, because Kashgar, it goes, as you come out of the city and go across the northwest of China, you have to go through a lot of desert. And obviously they can't fund that. They can't fund cameras all through the desert. But what they did have was little posts with red and blue lights on that were always flashing to make you think that you're being watched. The police are watching you. And also what they had was little stands that flashed as you go by. And they were called number plate recognition things. And I could tell that they weren't real. I don't know why. They were a bit too plasticky, a bit too frequent. And it was just funny. You constantly felt like you were being observed, watched, judged. And the people were very scared to do anything that was out of the norm. And one of those things was picking up a hitchhiker. But there was the odd person here and there that would. And they were people I'd describe as belonging more in the West. They were really free-thinking types, and they probably saw the hitchhiker as a representation of free thinking. So they'd always pick me up. They'd be the best people, really. Absolutely amazing. So they'd always invite me in and give me food. And if they were busy as well, they'd always buy me a meal at a service station. They'd make sure I was okay, you know. So they were lovely. But if you visit China, you probably won't meet those people because you have to be hitchhiking to see them come out, really. But anyway, that was China. Next came Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia went fairly quickly because by that point I was at the end of the trip and I just wanted to get it done. So went all the way down to Singapore, and by that point enough people were following the trip that two of them actually said, I'll pay for your flight, half of your flight to Australia to get you to the next part, and they did. And so that's how I hitchhiked to Australia. So that took about 2 years, and then I was in Australia for 3 years, and again I'd rebuilt my life there. I'd gotten a girlfriend, I was studying accounts for a counselling diploma, so I had a university, whatever, and had a job, several jobs. We'd moved a couple of times together, me and this girlfriend, and that was that. And so leaving that was really, really difficult. I won't go into it now, but we were in love. We thought we were going to get married, and it just didn't work though. She didn't want to come back to the UK, and I don't blame her. The weather's terrible. It's not a poor country, but things are very expensive now. And in Australia, they're not. People are quite rich. People are very happy. There's a lot of land. It's sunnier, or it's much warmer. So on paper, it's a much better country, but I couldn't live there. It wasn't my home. The more I was there, the more homesick I got. So I had to come back. And then I did, and I got the flight. Obviously, we had COVID happening, so that was quite frightening because I didn't think I'd ever be able to come home at one point because the flights were grounded, and we didn't know if COVID was around forever and if it was always going to be us in lockdowns. I know a lot of people have their own stories about that, but mine was I didn't think I'd ever be able to come home. So eventually though, the flights came on, and I booked one of the first flights back to the UK, 47 hours. It went from Western Australia to the Far East to Tokyo and then back to the UK, so sort of a J shape, I suppose. And then coming back, it was like emerging from a coma. I remember seeing people, but they looked different. Everyone looked a bit different. They just looked like they'd been through some changes as people. You know, people had gotten married in that time. People had maybe had a kid. My model of that person, so to take my friend Jack, for example, when I met him again, last time I saw him, he was at university still. And he had a certain girlfriend, and he was quite anxious about leaving university and what he'd do. You know, everyone had their own little worries, had their own little life plan and this and that. But jump ahead 5 years is a long time, and a lot had happened in that time. And he was now living in Brighton, in a flat, with a job, and he'd just broken up with another girlfriend. And not being around for that was quite upsetting for me as a friend, because I hadn't been around with him for the first breakup, hadn't been around during all this worry about should I move, should I stay, should I get this job, that job, and celebrating this new girlfriend that he was now breaking up with after years. So it was like being in a coma. I'd missed a lot, and that was just one person. Everyone else, one of my friends was engaged, and my mum had a boyfriend when I'd left, and there was a lot going on with him, and he turned out to be a really horrible person, and I wasn't around to give her a hug when it all fell apart, that kind of thing. And she'd now moved house, which was it was just strange, a lot happening. And what needed to happen as well, when you're away for 5 years, it's not all these superficial updates that you miss, it's the development of each person. Everyone grows over time, for better or for worse, and so they actually become a different person. So what I had to do was get to know this person again. So thankfully in Australia I'd done really well with investing. I didn't have to work for 6 months, so I could afford to just travel to this friend, travel to that friend. For about 4 months I was just staying with a friend for 2-3 days, going to see a family member for 2-3 days, seeing a friend. And then by the time I'd seen everyone, the first person was free again and they could spend time with me. So it took months to catch up with each person, to adapt my image of who they were, what they wanted, because their goals had changed, their priorities had changed, my goals and priorities had changed. So we had to spend a lot of time just updating each other on who we were, which is really strange, because I thought that when I came home things would just be the same. I don't know why I thought things would be the same, but they definitely weren't the same. Little things as well, like, when I left my dad's house in Swindon, a new shopping area had just been built, like a shopping park. It now looked really old, and the sign was a bit rusty, and things just looked a bit older around as well. And there were new houses randomly and things like that. There were a couple more things that were different that you may not have noticed in the UK if you've lived here non-stop. One of them was coming home and technology changing. So everyone was on their phones when I came back. Everyone had it in their pocket and they were constantly getting it out, looking at it, getting it out, looking at it. This has become normal now for some reason. It's really odd. And one of them was, so my dad as well, when I left 5 years previously, he just had a phone to call a friend or to receive a telephone call, that kind of thing. He wasn't really addicted to his phone, but when I came back, he had it out on the table. He was just looking at little messages coming up, and I thought, what's going on here? Like, everyone is now obsessed with their phone. And that happened over those 5 years, I think, because even teenagers, even young adults weren't that obsessed. We'd still be mostly present in the world. But that happened somewhere between 2017 and 2022. So also you could pay with your phone. You could tap your phone to pay for stuff, and that blew my mind. People didn't carry wallets anymore. And I did for a long time because I didn't trust it. I thought, well, what if your card declines? What if you have to put it in the machine? But apparently that's not a thing that happens much anymore. And also, you could pay with your watch. That was a new thing. And your ring. And you could talk to someone on your wristwatch. There was all these little updates in technology that had happened very quickly. So 111 as well, the health service, that when I came home, people kept saying, oh, just call 111. And I was like, what is that? Isn't it 999? And it took until recently to actually ask, what is 111? And people said, "What do you mean? What do you mean? What is 111?" And because it had come out when I'd been away between those 5 years, and I think it came out around COVID. I'm not sure, but yeah, I know what it is now. It's you call it for non-urgent medical advice, as far as I know. But even now, there's little things like people will say, "Oh, like something about someone called Joe Wicks," and that was during my time away. I didn't pick up on that at all. Little cultural things like there was, I can't remember what it was called. There was a restaurant that got big during COVID and then went bust afterwards, and I completely missed that. And when we're watching TV or we're having a conversation, even now, there's people will mention stuff that I've got no idea about, and it's really quite unsettling when that happens, because it does feel like I've been in a coma. I've missed a part of my life in this country, and it's hard because then they have to explain things that are so clear and obvious because everyone's been around for it to happen, but I wasn't. I was away. So one final thing that had changed when I came home was people were a lot more careful about what they say. You have to these days be very careful what you say. You can't make jokes anymore if it might upset someone. Whereas when I left in 2017, I remember you could joke about anything and it would maybe upset someone, but a joke normally upsets someone. But people knew how to take jokes a lot better. Now you you just have to be very careful with your word selection, and people actually more often now hold back their speech because they're scared of how it might come across. Now that wasn't the case back in 2017. It was maybe beginning to get like that, but I came back and people just seemed a lot more scared, really. And that's a really sad thing that's happened over the last 5 years. Over, well, not the last 5 years, between 2017 and 2022. Um, so in some ways things have gotten worse over that time. In some ways they've got better. Technology's gotten better, but also people have, I suppose, immersed themselves a lot more in the world of the internet, and it's now bled a lot into reality, I suppose. So yeah, and that was only 5 years. I know some people are in comas for longer, but it's it's very odd. So anyway, I'll leave it there. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week.